So I recently made a video on this computer where I utilized $25 worth of upgrades to turn it into a decent gaming machine and was actually pretty successful. However, in this video, we're going to be taking a bit of a different look at it, focusing on the motherboard's integrated graphics, the ATI HD 3200 IGP. The computer in which this chip is on was originally an HP A6000, but from the time it had been purchased to the time I got my hands on it, it had seen multiple upgrades that definitely impacted its performance for the better. But as an OEM machine, the A6000 originally shipped with an AMD Athlon 4200 Plus, 2 sticks of DDR2 memory with a capacity of 512 megabytes each, a 250 gigabyte 7200 RPM hard drive, and relied on the HD 3200 graphics integrated onto the motherboard, which we'll be focusing on today. By the time I got this computer though, it already received a few upgrades as the processor installed on the system was the AMD Phenom 9550 and there were two 1GB sticks of DDR2 installed onto the system. This would have made for a useful system back in 2009, but in 2020 it doesn't hold up so well. Now, there are two different versions of the HD 3200. One was the mobile variant, which was found in laptops, while the other was the desktop variant, which I'll be showcasing to you today. For the most part, they are pretty similar aside from the release date and a few other things, but the main difference from a specification standpoint was that the non-mobile variant of the IGP ran a core clock 120 MHz faster than the mobile one. Otherwise than that, they were about the same, with the same amount of ROPs, TMUs, shading units, compute units, and transistors. Additionally, the HD 3200 supports up to DirectX 10 and was built off the 64nm process as well as the terascale architecture. The specs that I just listed in terms of the GPU components are none too impressive and gave me a good idea of the performance to expect from this integrated graphics processor. Some other information regarding this hardware is that the HD 3200 was apparently based off the previous generation's HD 2400 graphics core, and that this IGP utilized a feature called Hybrid Crossfire X that allowed it to work side by side with a dedicated graphics card to increase the overall system performance. This technology was released in early 2008 with the HD 3200's debut coming a few months later in March. At the time of its release, this chip actually seemed to be at least decently received, with some people calling it surprisingly powerful, and honestly, after these benchmarks, I can't say that I disagree considering its age. Back then, and especially not today, you wouldn't have been able to play AAA titles with maxed out settings, but it was something you could scrape by with in older games if you couldn't afford a dedicated graphics card. In modern days, and as some of these cards do, the HD 3200 had a few issues with its driver installation. For this computer, I did a clean offline installation of Windows and eventually googled something to the effect of HD 3200 drivers download. This wasn't the troublesome part though, and when I thought I needed, I quickly located. After launching the EXE and running the install, the AMD Catalyst install manager actually completed, a bit to my surprise, but a graphics driver error occasionally popped up even after the fact. So I consulted the internet, and on one forum they said to delete the AMD folder under my C drive, which I did, and to reinstall the drivers, which ultimately didn't fix the error. But I realized I can make this a lot easier on myself instead, so after cleaning out anything even resembling an AMD driver from the PC, I went into Device Manager and updated them the easy way, and this actually worked out well. Upon restarting the computer and gaming for a bit, no more errors regarding graphics drivers popped up, so it's safe to say that this IGP was running with the appropriate software. So that's all the specs and the basic setup I did to get the HD 3200 working under at least semi-optimal conditions. Before we get into the benchmarks, how about you click that little red subscribe button below? You should do it, it's free, and smart people like free things. Okay, now onto the benchmarks. For this set of testing, I didn't do any synthetic benchmarks, but instead ran 11 different games, ranging all the way from Doom 2 to Minecraft, the latter which actually ran semi-playably and initiated the testing. The version of Minecraft I played on this computer was the latest release at the time, version 1.16.1. I played the game with all the lowest settings selected in a view distance of 2 chunks. With this, the average frame rate was 39 FPS, but the gameplay felt a lot less smoother than it looked and it's hard to describe. Regardless, I then raised the settings up to 4 chunks, and this time the average frame rate came to be 27 FPS. During testing, the GPU was almost always pinned at 100% usage, while the Phenom 9550 was, for the most part, from the lower 30s to the 50s with the occasional spike in usage while loading in new chunks. Because the Minecraft test didn't go so hot, get it because the CPU was always overheating, I then ran a less demanding game on the system, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. This game has very low system requirements, even lower than what was available to the computer, but I still ran it in the resolution of 1280 by 1024 with all the lowest settings in order to achieve the highest possible frame rate. With this configuration, the average FPS was 55. During testing, the CPU had a very high utilization percentage, whereas the HD 3200 did not. So, after I learned about frame rate limiters, I then tried to turn on that option in settings to see how it would affect the performance. This didn't go so well, and after doing so, the game refused to boot up ever again. I don't know why, it might have been from an unrelated issue, but this was the last change I made to the game before it broke. Since GTA San Andreas ran so well, I knew GTA 3 would also, but I wanted to find out just how much better. Now, of all the tests done today, aside from Doom 2, this game ran the best, and with decent settings as well. The resolution was 1600 by 900, and the quality options varied, but were generally set to medium with no frame rate limiter applied. With this, the average frame rate was 85 FPS, and as expected, the game ran great. Afterwards, I booted up and played some of Valve's Half-Life 2 on this computer. I knew this game would be harder to run than GTA 3 was, so I ran the game in 720p with all the lowest possible quality settings. After a few minutes, the average frame rate came to be 40 FPS, and throughout gameplay, the GPU saw significantly higher utilization than the CPU did. To be honest, I expected that the performance would have been a bit better than it ultimately was, but regardless, the game ran well enough and was more than playable, so what more could I ask for? Following Half-Life 2, I played some Far Cry 1 on this system. With a resolution of 1600 by 900 and all the lowest quality settings applied, the average frame rate was 29 FPS. This was due to a mixture of gameplay in that while inside, the FPS was at or over 60, but while outside could fall to the lower teens. Due to this, I dropped the resolution down to 1280 by 720 and the average frame rate rose to 34 FPS with a similar mixture of gameplay, but the frame rate while outside rose to the lower 20s and upper teens. This made all the difference and the game was significantly more playable and, dare I say, enjoyable now. Since that went well, I then tried to play some Far Cry 2 on this computer. Now, Far Cry 2 is a much more demanding game, so before I even loaded it in, I lowered all the settings to the lowest and set the resolution to 480p. Due to this, I had to Alt-Tab out to adjust my overlay software, and in doing so, locked up the entire system, which required a hard reset. But the game launched just fine, and in this opening travel bit, the average frame rate was 34 FPS. Both the CPU and GPU saw high utilization, but the game would definitely run better on this computer if a better graphics processor was installed. After Far Cry 2, I then attempted to play some Elder Scrolls Morrowind on this computer and was actually pretty optimistic. With a resolution of 1024 by 768 and a mixture of medium settings, the frame rate provided an outstanding average of 80 FPS. Once again, the game ran great, but I only really played around in the opening bits of the game, so things could slow down in later game situations and a performance decrease should definitely be expected. The next game actually really disappointed me with its performance in Star Wars Battlefront 2 from 2005. I ran this game with a resolution of 1600 by 900 and all the lowest settings, but the VSync option refused to be toggled off and definitely contributed to the game's terrible performance and its pitiful average of 17 FPS. The game didn't run well, really, not even playably, and the gameplay was terrible throughout. I mean, I knew that the performance wouldn't be good, but the computer still exceeded the game's minimum system requirements by quite a bit. Overall, just a bit of a letdown. I also played some Call of Duty 2 on this system and decided to let it auto-detect the game's quality settings. This didn't turn out so good, and it automatically set the resolution to 1024 by 768 and applied a mixture of settings resulting in an average frame rate of 11 FPS. It was pretty bad, so I went back into settings, changed everything to as low as possible but left the resolution the same and re-entered the training ground. With these few small tweaks, the average frame rate over doubled and resulted in 27 FPS, a decent score. The only sort of failed benchmark I did in this computer was of Need for Speed Underground. Initially, I had high hopes for this game and ran it with all the high settings and a resolution of 1280 by 1024. Unfortunately, the game would indefinitely load with these settings, so I restarted the computer to hopefully fix the issue. However, even after decreasing the resolution as well as the settings to the lowest, the game still refused to let me play it. Oh well. Last but not least, I ran some Doom 2 on this computer. I mean, what is there to say? The game, as expected, ran great and was another good benchmark from the HD 3200 iGPU, thus concluding the review. Overall, I expected this integrated graphics processor to perform significantly worse than it ultimately did, and the fact that it even managed to start Minecraft impressed me quite a bit. The HD 3200 was able to run most games that came out years before and even after at least decently enough to be deemed playable and was better than I expected. Due to this, I suppose that it might have been able to be used as a low-end gaming PC back in the days of 2009, but the gameplay wouldn't have been too good, even on an older operating system such as Windows XP. That's another thing that I'd like to mention. I used Windows 10 64-bit as the OS in this build to see how the HD 3200 holds up in 2020 and not necessarily to look back at a realistic environment in which it would have been utilized before it was discontinued. And also, sometimes the 3200 was not as heavily utilized as the CPU in some of the benchmarks, so may have performed better on a system with better components. However, the HD 3200 is already a fish out of water in the current system that it is in, as 8GB of RAM would have been a ludicrous amount back in 2009, and the Phenom 9550 performed notably better than the original processor installed in the system, the Athlon 4200 Plus. But it put in a good show and held up pretty well, just not good enough by 2020 standards, or even by 2014 standards for that matter. And one last thing before you go, would you like exclusive videos and unreleased footage with the behind the scenes look into the channel? Well, then join the Discord, link in description. Regardless, thanks for watching and I hope you enjoyed the video. Also, please leave a comment below because interactions with viewers will help boost this video in the YouTube algorithm, and I guarantee that I'll respond to your comments. While you're at it, please subscribe because it helps a lot in video quality and production, also positively affects my day. Finally, leave any questions or suggestions in the comments below and have a great day. Bye.